Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I know it's been a while since we've seen each other. I was out last week and then we were out the week before. So it's great to be back with you on Wednesday night. As you know, if you don't know, my name is Kyra Reed. I am the organizer here at Higher Heights, the political home for Black women. We endorse Black women up and down the ballot in our top 100 cities, and we promote Black women getting involved civically. And so I'm really happy you're here with us tonight. I'm also very excited for this presentation. Over the last couple of sessions, I've seen a lot of questions about how we can get young people involved. And I realized I have an expert on youth engagement, and it's my friend Evan Malbrough. Evan is a young activist. He's now based out of DC, but he was originally based out of Atlanta. He founded the Georgia Youth Poll Working Project and has dedicated a lot of his career to getting young people involved. I'm going to do a couple of quick housekeeping. If you have any questions, you can put that in the Q&A box. It's the big question mark with Q&A. And then we have our chat function, which should be open to everyone, where you can jump in and just say hello, where you're from, why you're here, or just put in any comments. So the chat function is open. You can feel free to use it. And I will let Evan introduce himself. You're muted.
That always happens. Thank you, Ira. Thank you to Higher Heights for the opportunity for me to speak to you all today. My name is Evan Malbrough. I'm a native of Smyrna, Georgia, right outside of Atlanta. I I recently moved to Washington, D.C. about a month ago. It's going to be about a month and a half next week. And super excited to be here, talk about some youth engagement things. There's been a lot of conversations about young people during the recent elections and even in the 2020 election. And those conversations are going to continue. There's a lot of students who are going to be gaining their ability to vote in the coming days, months, and years. And they're going to have policy ideas, and it's going to be very important that we're able to bring them together and start pushing for progress. So I'm really excited to be here, and thank you guys for the opportunity.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Give me one quick second, and then you guys can put where you're from and what you're hoping to learn from this session in the chat. Um, Hold on. I'm like real discombobulated right now with the share screen. Um, oh my God. 1 second. It is not working for some reason. But never fret. Um, all right, and we are good to go.
Amazing. So I have named this presentation Establishing a New Constituency. I use that word very specifically because I do believe that a lot of the framing around young people is very individual, talking about like the individual side of the young people as well as the broad statistics. But I think what's very lacking is the idea of young people as a constituency and the concentration of their views plus their ability to organize and the strategies to bring them together, right? There's a lot of constituencies that elected officials respond to, whether it be folks who may be on Social Security, maybe folks in the AARP bubble, or folks who are pro-choice or pro-life, things like that, right? And I think what's really missing is this exploration on what the young constituency is and the recognition about how that constituency is going to be playing a major part in the election, whether they participate in it or not. Next slide. So about myself, my name's Evan Malbrough. I graduated from Georgia State University. I was in the class of 2020. I had the amazing opportunity to found the Georgia Youth Poll Worker Project. I also had the amazing opportunity to work for the ACLU of Georgia. I play cello. My favorite composer is Elgar, and then I love to write, with my favorite writer being James Baldwin. Next slide. So part one, what have the youth been up to? Next slide. So my favorite president and the best president and the only president from Georgia, rest in peace, Jimmy Carter once said that the experience of democracy is like the experience of life itself, always changing, infinite in its variety, sometimes turbulent, and all the more valuable for having been tested in adversity. And that's, of course, for Jimmy Carter, our 39th president. And, that last part, right, sometimes turbulent, all the more valuable having tested in adversity. I think we all can relate to that feeling of adversity, that feeling of being tested, and that really fear about where our democracy is going. Next slide. And then a few people I like to elevate in my presentations, and people who I've been very inspired by: Judy Holman, famous disability rights activist; Aretha Castle Haley, who's a voting rights activist; Charles Sherrod; Harry Belafonte, who is one of my personal favorites, especially as an outspoken organizer and activist, but also a musician and artist. I think he really learning about him really laid the groundwork for me of being able to pursue art, but also being able to fight for social justice. And of course, the late great John Lewis, youngest person to be on the speaking dais at the March on Washington, ends up going to Congress, and he was the congressman over Georgia State University when I attended, and I was in his district. So there's a few people I want to bring into space, and yeah, let's move forward. So a new level of engagement, right? So when we talk about Generation Z, we talk about people born from 1997 to 2012, and one of the most civically engaged and active generations in recent history, right? More than three-quarters of young people believe that they have the power and responsibility to change this country, and that this work goes beyond election, right? And I think you start to really see that in good ways and bad, right? Because you see a lot of Gen Zers saying that we really want to make change throughout the country. We really want to change systems that they believe are ineffective or harmful. And then they also believe that, voting isn't going to be the only thing. Now, that can show up in two ways, right? That can show up in a good thing where people vote, but then after election day, they get more involved. They join organizations, they do protests, they do sit-ins, they do all types of things. And then that can also happen in a bad way, right? Because there's a lot of Gen Zers and young people who don't believe that voting is a way to push things forward, and voting is a pathway for progress and change, right? So you see a lot of young people falling into those two categories of being very active, very involved, very critical, and you have them either participating in elections and many of them not. Next. Right. And then we're going to talk about the 2024 election, but we're also going to talk about like the run up to it, 2016 and 2020. I happen to have voted for my first election in the primary in 2016. So when we look at it, right, in the 2020 presidential elections, young people aged 25, 18 to 25 played a significant role in choosing the winners in local, statewide, and national elections. And then voter turnout in 2020 was up 11% compared to 2016. But now what we're seeing for 2024 in the recent data is that 47% youth voter turnout, and that young people's electoral participation in 2024 was slightly lower than in 2020, but much higher than in 2016. So what we're seeing is a little bit of a raising of the floor. 47% is still a little low. That's still less than half of those in Gen Z, and I'm sorry, those that are youth and in Gen Z. And we really want to get those numbers up, just because, Gen Z is set to, and the millennials to kind of together, set to be a very big voting bloc, very similar to the baby boomers after World War II. Next slide. And then young election workers, a lot of Gen Z are also stepping up to serve as election workers and getting more involved in the actual administrations of elections, right? You started to see it in 2016 as in 2020 as the COVID pandemic pushed a lot of, oh, wait, no, go back. Up, up, run away a little bit.
Crap, I don't know what happened. Hold on. There we go.
There
Sorry,
you go. There you go. There you go.
my
You're
hand like
done.
froze.
Yeah, a lot of Gen Z have decided after 2020 to serve as election workers, and you started to see a large rise. In 2016, if you looked at the numbers, less than 5% of all poll workers were under the age of 60. And now you're starting to see those numbers increase astronomically as more people are recognizing that election work is essential to bring in democracy. And of course, as the founder of the Georgia Youth Poll Worker Project, that is a great thing to see. Next slide. And then we're also looking at young people running for office, right? Millennial and Gen Z make up around 34% of the electorate. Is getting a little higher as well. From 2018 to 2020, there was a 266% increase in millennials running for Congress, one of the biggest increases we have ever seen. And according to an October 2024 report by Future Caucus, there were 241 millennial and Gen Z candidates who were on the general election ballot for Congress in 2024. So what you're starting to see is that Gen Z and the millennials, they are coming, right? They a lot of the seats that are either getting vacated or either because the elected official died or because they decided not to seek re-election. A lot of Gen Z are working to try to fill those spots and give their generation a lot more representation. Um, this year, almost all Gen Z citizens born in 1996 actually have the opportunity to run for office. And 70% of young people have stated that they have gotten their information about the 2024 election through social media. And I would say another big thing about Gen Z is what we're starting to see in recent research. I mean, I'm sure many of you guys have seen headlines about it, that there is a significant gender divide between Gen Z men and Gen Z women when it comes to things like values, outlooks on the economy, outlooks on democracy, and outlooks on each other. And that played a major role in the outcome of the 2024 election. Next up. And then also what you're starting to see is Gen Z being one of a generation that's actually starting to start a trend of global decline and dissatisfaction in democracy. This is something we were seeing globally. I remember a little bit more about my background. I was a voting rights activist my entire career. I actually just finished a term as the economic policy officer for the Netherlands consulate. The Netherlands, of course, being in Europe. And I was able to do that and have that opportunity for a year. And you learn a few things about how Europeans approach democracy, right? Very foreign to the US. In some European countries, you can get fined for not voting. It may be illegal for not voting, but even then, they are still seeing declines in youth's attitudes towards democracy. There was an interesting case in my home state of Georgia, where in Belgium, there was a phenomenon of two of I'm sorry, of expats who had children within the United States who were dual citizens. And what the Belgians were seeing is that even those dual citizens have a low engagement rates in both the United States elections and the Belgian elections, right? So and interestingly enough, with Belgium being a mandatory voting country, so you're starting to see a lot of global dissatisfaction with democracy. I'm sure many of you guys have seen the situations going into, I believe, Nepal, where a lot of Gen Z and millennials are engaging in protest, as well as there has been some political violence as well. You're starting to see a lot of, that the political spectrum of young people is really expanding, and you're starting to see very disparate outcomes. Currently, I checked the numbers this morning. President Donald Trump has an approval rating of 39 as of this week in office amongst Gen Z. Interestingly enough, Donald Trump is actually growing in his millennial support very ever so slightly. And then currently Congress has a 76 disapproval rating amongst young people, and that's as of Gallup today. Next up. And then, in the face of disillusionment, you're starting to see a lot of Gen Zers innovate. So we can go to the next slide. Another quote, favorite writer, not everything can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I see this quote as a very big motto for Gen Z, especially as Gen Z was, I would say, the purest social media generation, right? I believe the differences between millennials and Gen Z is this. A lot of millennials, they were able to experience social media in their late teens, going into college as well as adults. And then Gen Zers, they have pretty much lived almost their entire life in the scopes of social media. And I would say that even grows even bigger with Gen Alpha, that is that 2012 to 2025 birth, people who were born there. And I would say another big difference is, if you look at millennials experienced the first waves of social media that were pre-algorithm, meaning that oftentimes what they would see would be some recommendation, but mostly it was post generated by their friends and family. Right now, if you look at social media now, in order to get engagement, most social media sites have now opted to do infinite feeds, in which the vast majority of content that people are seeing are not actually from the people that they follow or choose to look at, but rather content that is given by an algorithm, right? So you could see that the millennial to Gen Z shift could also talk about a shift in social media and information, going back to about the fact that 70% of people got their news about the election from information. I'm sorry, got their news about the election from social media, which means that, right now we're in an era where a lot of people are trained to get trained to get their information from social media. And then a lot of times that social media algorithm is giving them information based on what they think they would like, not actually what they're opting into. And then going back to the quote, I think that social media is also given the opportunity for millennials and Gen Zs to face things head on due to the barriers that social media has brought. Right now, you can tweet people. Now you can make videos of people. We've seen situations where YouTubers have made videos about public figures and even getting responses. There was a Black socialist YouTuber, I think his name is FD Signifier. He released a video on another famous Atlantean, Killer Mike. It was a critique video, and you actually saw in real time Killer Mike seeing it and taking an interview, responding to it, right? So the gap between young people and their leaders is extremely small, and I think both sides are really starting to recognize that conversation is essential to how Gen Z communicates. Next up. Okay, so what about active after the election? You see some pretty interesting thing, right? 84% of people surveyed said that the work to improve communities go beyond elections and voting. I think that's really good. I think that's probably one of the most how do I say, one of the most uplifting stats, that there's a lot of Gen Z and there's a lot of young people who are willing to do the work. I think they just need some space to do it. And then as I said before in my past slide, more than ever, more young people are using social media to hold their elected officials and community leaders accountable. You saw it as a big start in 2020 with the Black Lives Matter protests. We were all in the house, so social media was our public square. But even now, social media is an essential part into how Gen Z and many millennials communicate, and elected officials are now starting to learn that, whether it be through direct communication through posts or through creating content that explores the issues that Gen Zers see. And then another thing you're starting to see is podcasts. Podcasts now are a bigger thing, right? Because podcasts have become so famous and become such a new media source. My theory is it replaced radio because they're pretty much the same concept. You're starting to see that you saw how big it got and how impactful it was in the election, depending on what the presidential candidates or the congressional candidates went on. And then a little bit for before the election, when young Americans believe their friends will vote, 79% plan to vote themselves, compared to just 35% amongst those who think their peers won't participate. So there definitely is this communal feeling that goes into voting, right? If a young person has another young person that they can look at that is civically engaged, that is talking about voting, it more than doubles their willingness and ability to vote. Next up. And then I would say, in the face of disillusionment, young people have turned to alternative ways of making change outside of the ballot box. And what does that change look like? Next slide. Yeah, so young people have invested in using social media and the advent of instant cash transfer services to provide direct aid to those in need. If you look on a lot of social media sites, you're starting to see a lot of people asking for Cash App, asking for Venmo, and a lot of people using these platforms to revolutionize fundraising and get small dollar donations to people in need as quickly as possible. Young people have turned to protests to voice their discontent with government and companies. You're starting to see a lot more protests popping up around the United States, in opposed to many policies that are going on. And that's not even just in the US, that's global, right? As I said, I brought up Nepal earlier. Protests are growing. Students have been on the front lines pushing their academic institutions to divest from institutions that hurt their communities. You saw that as a big divisive point when it came to the 2024 election. Students engaged in protests for a cacophony of reasons. Many people protested the Israeli and Palestinian conflict that is currently ongoing and where their university placed in it. But that wasn't the first type of protest that students have done. You have seen many protests, even before October 7th, where students were protesting their university's investments in the oil industry, citing that the support of fossil fuels hurts their future because of climate change and global warming. Even going back to a throwback in the, I want to say 90s, but I was born in 97, so I might be a little off. You saw that, students coming out of the South African apartheid protests and protesting their universities to divest from South Africa during the apartheid state. So you start to see those protests going a lot larger. You're starting to see a lot of students directly protesting what their school's endowments go into. If you look at a lot of these schools have endowments the sizes of small countries, and that they are managed like hedge funds, right? So students are really taking a granular view into what their schools are investing in, and they actually see it as an extension of what they themselves are investing in. And then even on the community side, right? You've seen a blow up in creating green and sustainable solutions in their community, like community gardens to fix food deserts, as well as direct mutual aid program for products, whether it be things like feminine care products and bathroom. There's been many movements to make those free of charge, as well as things for students as well. Next slide. And then another thing, expanding democracy. Union membership amongst young people is at an all-time high. This is a trend that we are starting to see amongst young people. Young people's attitudes towards unionization and collective bargaining has gone up higher. I would say a big example of this is Starbucks, right? You're starting to see a lot of Starbucks unionizing, asking for higher wages, the ability to take tips, and more resources. Amazon, you've seen a lot of people organizing in Amazon, and then just in general, a lot of young people feel very economically disenfranchised, and they see that the source of that economic disenfranchisement is the fact that higher level CEOs and executives and stockholders are getting these large payouts, while many young people feel like they can barely scrap by, and even further, they can't get ahead. And in that, you're starting to see a lot more positive attitudes towards unions that many people have compared to the start of the gilded, I'm sorry, to the end of the gilded era. So you're starting to see a lot more young people more open to getting educated about unions, and then even starting union themselves. Also, young people are challenging the two-party system. The two-party system has been caught in the eye and the ire of a lot of young people. A lot of young people don't feel like they have a political home in either the Democratic or Republican Party. And that's where you start to see different people come up and being able to take advantage and gain power, speaking to those young people. One example is I know the big example would be Zoran, but I can actually go back to my old district in Georgia where I lived. A Democratic Socialist won. His name was Gabriel Sanchez. He beat a Democratic Party member for the state time. I think she had 3 terms. And if you look at the numbers, a lot of the people that voted for him were renters and young people. Now, and if we go into New York, a little north from where I am now, you see Zoran Mondambi. Zoran Mondambi is a Democratic Socialist, and he's one of the most popular New York mayoral candidates for young people, and it's very likely that young people will carry him to the election to winning the New York mayorship. And while the Democrats and the Democratic Socialists are two distinct parties and the Republicans seem like one party, I would argue that there is a major split in the Republican Party amongst young people and their older counterparts, right? A lot of young people in the Republican Party do not agree with some of the economic policies, some of the foreign aid policies that even the Trump administration is doing. And I can see a situation where, especially when after Trump is out of office, the conservative splitting as well. We saw very early signs of this during the Freedom Caucus that came in, and then what was that the Freedom Caucus? There's one more that came in right after Obama came in that has been growing. So I think what you'll start to see is a lot of conservative splitting between a conservative anti-interventionist right and then a more neocon right. And then young people are on the fights for voting rights, right? A lot of young people have been fighting not just to make voting easier once you turn 18, but actually when you're younger. There are multiple campaigns across this country for local elections to include those who are 16 and 17, with the idea that a 16 and 17-year-old works, pays taxes, and has real things to worry about in this day and age, and that they should have some space to pick who represents them. And I think what you're also starting to see is that this is like the soft power that many young people are trying to push on their elected officials, right? As you look back to the post-Gilded Age era, unions were very important. Unions were very important in this election. And a lot of young people are starting to see that collective power could be the key to getting the policies they want. Next up. And my thesis of my pretty much the thesis of my entire presentation is that the actions of this generation are not indicative of a constituency that has lost faith in democracy, but rather one that questions and change and seeks to change and improve the system our democracy is housed in. And I think that's really explains a lot of young people. I think a lot of young people, whether they vote or not, whether they believe in democracy or not, a lot of young people, or whether they're Democrat, Republican, left or right, a lot of young people have the consensus that the current system that we're living in is not sustainable for the futures we want to build. Now, the question is, how can we synthesize that to actually get policies that help young people, right? If you look amongst left and right people, you actually start seeing the same things, right? Ability to buy a house is a big one. Ability to pay off student loans and other types of debt is a big one. Access to job opportunities, right? You're seeing that for college graduates right now, it is very hard to get an entry-level position. Something I can empathize with. I graduated during COVID. It was very similar. So you're starting to see these young people really gaining economic consciousness and really challenging what economic system we are in and how that affects it, right? Because you can't have democracy without economics, right? You need, but they both work in tandem, and young people are really trying to see, well, what mixes work for them. Some still are on the capitalist side, a lot of them are moving over to the socialist side, and I think that's going to be the big fight for Generation Z going forward. Next up. And then also continuing to look back at 24, if you look at the states that had the highest voting, it was Minnesota, Maine, and Michigan, the M's. And then Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana had the lowest turnout. Young Latinos, interestingly enough, of both genders, experienced the highest drop in youth turnout from 2020 to 2024. And on average, states with policies that make it harder to register to vote had the lowest level of youth voter turnout. And then, if you look at going back to what I said earlier, the gender gap, young women, Gen Z and millennial women, 17 plus for Harris, young men, 14 plus for Trump. That's one of the largest gender divides when it comes to election in modern statistics. And it has many social repercussions because it also goes into a divide of the experiences of many young men versus many young women, right? If you look at it now, Gen Z is one of the first generation where young women are actually outpacing young men in education. In many urban areas, Gen Z women are outpacing young men in wages. And being it with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and many other policies that states are putting onto the constituency of young women, you're starting to see a lot of young women get more and more politically active and more outspoken. And You see the same thing with men, but it's more social, right? I think a lot of women in the Gen Z generation are really looking at policy and systemic issues, while a lot of young men are really looking at social and personal issues. If you look at a study that happened amongst Gen Z that came out last week, a large amount of conservative young men see how many seeing having and having children, how many children they're having as a major indicator of success, while many men are saying how many children they're having as an indicator of success, while many women are saying their career and their education are indicators of success, right? Men are saying marriage and family is a high value idea for what their lives are, and then women are family and marriage are on the lower tier, right? So you're starting to see these separations in young men and women that are coming out, and you saw that in the election. And then also, I would bring in that the algorithm also contributes to this a lot, right? If you look at the content that is geared towards young men, both Black men, white men, and Latino men, a lot of it is kind of what I would very much consider, and I know this might be very weird to say, kind of like the idea of like the old South with the Confederacy. I think a lot of men in these days are looking for a version of masculinity that they don't believe that they can achieve, whether it be because of the changes, the political and economic statuses of women, or the economic anxiety and the economic pressures that men feel today, kind of similar to how a lot of Southerners felt for the Confederate South, right? And I think in both cases, they're both trying to fight for something that is impossible to get back. And then with women, if you look at a lot of content, a lot of women, as I said before, are very policy focused, are very policy based, right? If you go into a lot of these orgs, if you go into a lot of these orgs are ran by the leadership of women, Black women especially, and a lot of the positions that are getting cut, especially DEI positions, are supposed to um, directly combat policy and inequality. They're getting cut, right? You saw in the federal government has probably contributed, the layoffs in the federal government and the DEI layoffs have probably contributed to one of the largest mass layoff periods for Black women in American history. So you're really starting to see, and I think this is going to be a through line through all the elections, especially as all the Gen Zs actually get into the above 18 category. You're really going to start to see, how that gender divide really affects it. And then what the real question is going to be is how are they going to come together, right? Because we all have to live in this country together, but how is that discourse going to happen going forward, right? And then also another thing, even with the young voters that voted for Harris, Kamala Harris got less support than Biden in 2020. You could really can attribute that to young men. Hillary Clinton experienced a lot of the same things, but it's amongst all age groups. Next up, and then what you're also starting to see, and this is also going into the great divides we see in this country, college educated voters and non-college educated voters. There's always been a divide. I would say that in a lot of organizing and a lot of campaigns, there's always been a blind spot to non-college educated voters in both parties. Because of the idea that college degrees and degree attainment is tied to economic prosperity, which is tied to likeliness to vote, right? Oftentimes, people in college are the most likely to vote. Oftentimes, and people who have college degrees are the most likely to vote because oftentimes they have the economic incentives to do so. But that is a very large voter block. Many people in college may be surprised when I say this, but the vast majority of Americans don't have a college degree, have never stepped foot on a college campus, and never will. And I think when you look at the media and when you look at a lot of these conversations that are held, those who are not college educated are oftentimes feel left out. And usually when that happens, there is a backlash. And oftentimes that backlash supports the person who is able to talk to them. And as you can see, um, Trump got a lot of those voters without that college experience. And going back to the men and women divide, you're also, as I said before, a lot of women are getting college degrees. I believe it was either 2030 or 2040. For every two I'm sorry, for every one man that gains a college degree or a post-secondary degree, there will be two women gaining college degrees, right? So that education gap is going to balloon. And we're going to see how that affects the gap in what people are voting for. Right now, of course, the numbers aren't just black and white. A lot of men have adopted to technical colleges, becoming plumbers, electricians. America is trying to grow chip manufacturing. Those jobs you can get with a technical college degree. But you're going to really start to see that divide, and it's going to be very interesting when those fights come up for economic bills, right? Because a lot of these college or government funding, we're starting to see it, right? With Trump taking away that government funding. I think we're really going to see where those values lie. Next up. Yep. And then young voters were much less likely to prioritize immigration and slightly more likely to prioritize abortion. But the top issue is always the money. The economy and jobs was one of the biggest impact on who voted for whom and what they wanted to see, right? The labor shortage is pushing the American colleges into crisis with the plunge of enrollments in the worst ever recorded in 2023. And because a lot of young people don't believe that a college degree is the ticket to the middle class that many of their parents and grandparents may have pushed them to go into college to achieve. But it's still the economy, right? So economic issues are still going to be at the top of mind for many Gen Z. That's something they share with their parents, their grandparents, and their great grandparents. A lot of people really want candidates who are going to speak to their economic anxiety. Now it shows up in different ways. Some people attribute anxiety economic anxiety with the fact that immigration has taken away a lot of jobs and oversaturated the labor market. A lot of people say it's wage inequality. People are getting jobs, but they can't support themselves on their jobs. They have one, two, three jobs to do it. And then a lot of people are saying, well, I got my college degree, I got my job, but I got loans. So even though I have the job and I have that middle class lifestyle or middle class salary, I'm so weighed down by debt that there's no chance for me to buy a house. There's no chance for me to get married. I saw a statistic that the average marriage in America costs $25,000, right? So these things are real, and I think these things are going to be ever present in elections to come, and I think it's going to be very present in 2026, especially because it'll be the first election after the current austerity measures of the Trump administration. So how can we support? A few things. I would say investing long term. And when I mean investing long term is I think a lot of things get caught in election by election, and I think that's where we lose people. I think that the roller coaster of engagement that comes in between the midterms and the presidentials, I think that leaves a lot of young people left behind. If you look at, for example, Latinos, both in 2020 and 2024, Latinos felt that Latinos statistically got the least amount of political engagement from candidates and nonprofits, right? That's a structural issue. Same with non-college educated voters, right? People always talk about how 33% of the country voted for Trump, 34% of the country voted for Harris, and the rest stayed on the couch, right? Well, it's not just the fact that the rest just decided not to vote. A lot of them have not been contacted. And I think that's a big gap that we really need to figure out a way, either using data or using boots on the ground to get in front of them. Be open to change. I would say that both of the parties right now are in a changing period. And I think that's because of the numbers, right? Because it's going to get to a certain point where a president or a senator or a House member cannot win without the approval of Gen Z. In the same way, many presidents could not win without the approval of the baby boomer generation. And then allow students to learn from failure. I think there's definitely been a power creep and a mission creep of student achievement and students in organizing. And I think, there should be a lot more time to let students try things out and not come down with the hammer of them. And then also not demonize students, whether they be protesting or whether they be organizing and activating. I think a lot of young people feel a lot of anxiety because they feel like they have to vote for a specific candidate or they're not let in. And I think that both parties can do a better job of creating pipelines for young people to be leaders of the future. Next up. And then a few guiding tips. Platform don't dictate, right? Like most people, young people don't like being dictated to. I think the best strategy for getting young people involved is to get as many young people platformed and engaging in this conversation as possible. Lead with listening. Going back to that first point, fill in needs, right? I think there's a lot of need amongst young people that they don't feel like they have the opportunity or power to address. And I think that's where that intergenerational connection can go a long way. Meeting people where they are, when it comes to social media disinformation, I think there is a large demonization factor of people who believe disinformation. But at the end of the day, especially with AI, the disinformation issue is just going to get worse and worse because people are going to start seeing videos that look as real as possible and have no basis in reality, and then their reality will have no basis in reality. So I think it's going to take a lot of work. Structure is important. I think a lot of things I see with youth orgs, um, what I see a lot with youth orgs is like they have the fervor, they have the vigor to get involved, but they don't know any structures. They don't have enough structures to actually push their ideas long term. And I think that's something that the young generation we really need to start talking about is the long term. And I hope I haven't been too partisan in this presentation, but if to give the right at least some credence, their long term strategy and their farm system is phenomenal. Their ability, I have very friends who are very deep in the Republican Party. If you talk about them achieving their goals, whether it be on the coordination on the state level, going to the federal level in Congress, and then going to the court, you really start to see these 20, 30, 40-year plans and they're just coming to fruition now. And I think the big challenge for the liberal side is to really get young people on those types of plans because that's what wins in the end of the day, right? We're not going to change these things overnight. We're not going to change these things with one election. And I'm going to be very honest, we're not going to change these things and I think many young people would agree, we're not going to change these things with just Democrats, right? So you got to keep that in mind. Be clear on your why. So I think a lot of Gen Z, they really care about the why. A lot of people call it purity testing, but I think a lot of people just call it safety, right? I think many people are scared of following people and not turning out right, because it's coming out on the other end that there was ulterior motive. And then minimize unpaid labor, right? As a person who did 3 unpaid internships, loved them, they were great, but we need to start paying people, man. And trust me, because I'm an older Gen Z, I'm 97, so I'm considered old now. Especially if you say you're born in the 90s, amongst a bunch of young people, they'll call you old, they'll call you unk. But I've reached out to young organizations talking about collaborations and presentations, and they hit me back and say, where the money at? And you got to respect it because it is the labor. Next slide. And that is my presentation. Thank you all for your time today.
Um, Thank you, Evan. That was great. I know we have some questions. I know I sent you some questions and we're going to read over those as well as please feel free to use the Q&A function. I see we already have a couple in there. And we do have about 15, 20 minutes for questions. And so I will launch into a couple just to get us started. Also, thank you. Zenobia, she asked, what was the name of the social media influencer you mentioned recently?
Which social? I have to go back. Which one was it? Which slide was it? If I could get that.
Um, so wait, can you put it in the chat, what you were imply like what you were hinting at, and then I can just read some other questions. Um, so one of the questions that I had for you was why are young voters often labeled as apathetic, and what is missing from that narrative? I know in the past working with young people, I've seen apathy, but I've seen it turn into action. And so I don't know if I necessarily agree that Gen Z is apathetic. I'm a millennial, and when you said people who were born in the 90s is old, that did kind of sting.
Oh,
And
they
so
get on. They get on
I
me. They call me
and
old. They
and
call me old.
so I guess what I'm saying is like, why are we calling, their want for something different, like apathetic, and how can we fix that narrative, especially like where like, as organizers, as volunteers, as Black women, how can we like meet that apathy with a lot of grace, but also push it to action and control that narrative instead of just kind of letting them fall by the wayside?
Because I think what happened is a lot of young people, their entire social circles online. And COVID just exacerbated that, right? So call out culture, people that can't, it's mostly call out culture because nobody's really getting canceled. Call out culture has created a immediate feedback loop. The immediate feedback loop of what feels like advocacy, right? Because if you can call someone out on this social issue, if you can blast them on Twitter, if you can write an op-ed, you would get that instant gratification. You'll get those likes. And that, in a lot of young people, that is social capital for young people. But the problem is it doesn't translate well into the material world. And in order to go off of that, you really need to reach people who, unfortunately, right now are very unreachable outside of social media. So I think there needs to be a concerted effort to accepting that, hey, a part of being a social student, I think where people get wrong is saying we need to get people off social media. I think it needs to come to a strategy of accepting the fact that people are going to be on social media, people are going to call out, people are going to talk ish, and we need to figure out direct strategies to say, hey, I'm glad you made that tweet. I'm glad you put that Instagram story. I'm glad you wrote that think piece. Here are some ways you can extend that to something that's tangible. And I think that's what you're starting to see with young people because one great example of that is social media and unionization. I fully believe that we would not have the unionization era if that we have now if young people weren't directly ranting about how horrible their jobs are and how underpaid their jobs are. So I think sometimes people get turned off by the call out culture of social media and not recognizing the fact that that's just how they communicate. And if you can work through that, you can really push them to something that's tangible.
Here's another question from Nona.
Oh,
A heavy question, but so Charlie Kirk, who was killed today. One of the discussions was his influence on youth on the
oh,
Republican side, particularly young men. What are your thoughts around that? And I actually like recently heard a podcast where it was talking specifically not really about Charlie Kirk, but Turning Point USA's like reach. And so, like, how, someone, Melissa just said voter stats suggest that younger folks don't vote. But I've learned, there are these like weird pockets of mainly like conservative influencers who are targeting those pockets of like young men who are apathetic and don't vote and like turning them out to be like activists. And so I guess since you use social media a lot too, kind of going back to her question, what are your thoughts around that?
So with Charlie Kirk, so the interesting thing about Charlie Kirk, of course, I don't really agree with what Charlie Kirk says, but I would always say that if you look at the youth organization that has probably had the biggest impact in the 2020s, and I would even say since Trump's first election, I would say it's Turning Point USA started by Charlie Kirk. Honestly, I don't think Trump becomes president without Charlie Kirk. So of course I'm not going to be advocating for violence. I don't agree with violence or shooting people. But what Charlie Kirk was able to do was kind of fill in a gap because what they caught on to was when the economy started failing, men lost a lot of the idea that they were told that was masculine, right? That they're saying that they basically got the issues of I can't buy a house, I can't get a good job to sustain a family, I can't afford a family, nevertheless afford myself, and I have no economic mobility. That's what a lot of young men were experiencing. What Charlie Kirk did was, okay, that's the case. What's the issue with that? Women, immigrants, liberals. Same strategy. And then what also Charlie Kirk did, he actually hit on what I was talking about in my previous answers to the question. Turning Point is a multimedia operation. If you look at the major people in Turning Point, Ariane Denise, I hope I said your name correctly. Candace Owens, right? Candace Owens, maybe I don't know about if she's next, but Candace Owens, like she's a political figure, but she's also a major media figure, right? I know they had their falling out in kind of like the Turning Point Israel war, but a lot of people in Charlie Kirk's circle and in the Turning Point circle have major platforms on YouTube and TikTok, and they're able to put that messaging out. And the problem is that I believe that the left got there a lot late because I think the left avoided podcast. I think the left avoided the social media sphere because they saw it was misinformation, and they kind of put it in the category of like they kind of put it in the category of reality TV, right? Like I don't watch reality TV, but I do recognize that Americans love reality TV. Do I? And no matter what I think about it, right? If I want people to vote with me and I want people to follow me, reality reality TV is something that they'll turn on every day in their lives, right? And I think Kirk took that idea and replicated it on social media to the point where you're having so many young men who don't feel like they have any other options. He's been able to use the algorithm to put that content in. And that's why you saw a large amount of young men going to Trump because they didn't get any of that. They didn't get any of that any of that counter culture or that counter narrative, right? And then also, as if I criticize both sides, I think where the Democrats went wrong is I don't think they really pushed, especially in 2016, on the economic anxiety. I would say Vice President Harris, when she was running, she was more she didn't really have the opportunity to push against the narrative, which I read the first excerpt of her book this morning, which kind of speaks to it. Um, I think where the Democrats got wrong was they weren't able to translate that agenda as well as the right did to an online platform. And I think Charlie Kirk was that person for the right that was able to do that. If you look at a lot of the right-wing podcasters and a lot of the right-wing influencer, Charlie Kirk put them on. Charlie Kirk put money behind them, and Charlie Kirk gave them platforms, right? With this, unfortunately, the event that he was unfortunately killed at was one of the events that the right really created and became viral. The idea of going on a college campus and talking and coming at people. And, and while that discourse may not seem productive, it definitely is profitable and definitely gets to a lot of people fast.
Kind of going on that thing, you brought like reality TV. I've seen people like young people like, so and so is not authentic and like they kind of respond to like humor and those quips. I heard Mandami on a podcast and he was like super authentic, very funny. And so I guess like what role does like showing up authentically as a candidate play for young political engagement? Kind of going back to like the Turning Point USAs, or even when Kamala Harris announced that she was running for president, I saw that like memers like went in on like making her known. Like Kamala is Brat. Like you would see people with like shirts that said Kamala and the Brat font. And so like as we are kind of approaching like almost like the memification of like politics, like how do we as organizers in this particular space like show up in that way? Because it's very new to me um as a politico, but it's something that like I've seen young people get into almost automatically, and it's how can we still engage with youth voters without seeming like kind of the unk in the room too? Because that's how what
Hmm.
they're responding to right now.
My response to that would be I think a lot of non-Gen Zs and a lot of millennials responded. I think there's this idea that Gen Z they do like purity tests on people, which some do. I'll give it a crate. I'll stand on that. I'll fall on that sword. But I don't think it's more of the fact that they disagree with you. I think what Gen Z responds to most is inauthenticity. Like Gen Z will respect you more if you stand on what you say, and they may not like you, rather than if you teeter and try to get this big, or if you teeter or try to change what you're trying to say, um to fit a broader narrative. And I understand that's hard for candidates because candidates have to appeal, right? But I would argue Trump, unfortunately, is the king of that, right? Trump will say and do whatever he wants, and people agree with him, people disagree with him, people of his own party don't agree with him. He's beefing with his own party at this very moment. But what people will always say is, "Hey, the Trump I know is the Trump I'm gonna get." And I think for a lot of politicians, I think Zoran's really accepting this as well. I think what Gen Z sees for a lot of politicians is that they've decided to take more pomp and circumstance and respectability over actually saying how they feel and being willing to face like that some people may not just like them. Because also I would just say politicians saying how they feel goes viral, right? So it actually fits into that social media narrative. Zoran is going viral. Zoran has young people. It's because Zoran is unapologetic, right? And I think where people think that Gen Z wants perfection, I don't think so. I think Gen Z just wants authenticity. And I think Gen Z wants the choice to be able to say, hey, this is this authentic candidate. I know that he's authentic and I'm willing to fight him on the issues I don't agree with, but I at least know that who I am seeing is that person. I think the worst thing that any politician can, the worst label that any politician can have on them right now is this idea that they're inauthentic, right? Both sides of the spectrum, because I think that it hits at a level of distrust that a lot of Gen Zers have. Because I think a lot of Gen Zers get told that things are good when they're bad, and they're told that they should believe they're good because believing they're good fits a more cohesive narrative, and they're just not for that. And I think, and going back to the Trump argument, Trump was like that. He was very controversial, but he was like that. And going back to, unfortunately, Hillary Clinton and Vice President Harris, I would say with Hillary Clinton, there was a trust factor. Was it warranted? I would say about 80% of it was not warranted. Going back to Vice President Harris, I would say that, in my opinion, the moment she lost her chance of winning that election was when she was on that View interview and said, hey, is there anything you would do different than Biden would? And she said, nothing comes to mind. And then come to realize after you read this morning, she was actually prepped to give another answer. And then even going back to the Hillary Clinton example, she was prepped. There are books written. I've read a few books studying of like her staffers. There is a chance that Secretary Clinton at the time was going to come out with some type of universal basic income plan. And I think those type of things really go to the heart of like, I think young people will be fine if you push for something revolutionary and you fail, or you settle for something that well, I'm sorry, unfortunately, if you settle for something that is incremental and you still fail. You know what I mean? Like I feel like young people, they'll they'll mess with you if you put these big things out and you authentically fight for them and you lose, rather than saying, hey, we're going to do this, this, and this. Is it going to help your life a little bit? But then also, you'd still lose, if that makes sense.
It's kind of like those big swings.
Yeah, yeah, big
Yeah.
swing. Young people want big swings. Like I hope, and I hope this helps. A lot of young people are like, if you say incrementalism is like a slur, like you can't say incrementalism anymore. Like I think that word should be retired 100%, especially incrementalism for incrementalism's sake. And I think especially after this presidency, where they've seen what a president can do with the House, with the Senate, I think a lot of young people are saying, hey, I want that, but for my policies. I don't want people arguing over student loan forgiveness. I don't want people arguing over universal health care. We have money for wars. We have money for tax cuts. My life has not been better since 2006. So somebody needs to start talking about some real things that actually change.
And then our last question is from Ariane. And can you say a little bit more about this? She says, are Gen Z made for remote work only? Um,
Hmm.
I don't necessarily think so, but I will say, like in my experience working with Gen Z, they have a strong work ethic, but the way that like work was beat into me, where like you show up at 7 o'clock in the morning, you don't take PTO, you don't like I think that Gen Z, because of like COVID, they've learned like those like strong boundaries. And so I don't really think they're made for remote, more remote work only. I do think that just how they view work is just very different.
And I would agree. I don't think remote work would be as possible, would be as I don't think that, how do I say it? I think that if people were paid more, they'd be willing to go into the office more. And if people had more job security, I do think that Gen Zs do enjoy remote work. I think hybrid is probably going to be the I would say that's going to be the policy that people fall on. But what I would say is I think a lot of Gen Z see is very hard to go into work 5 days a week for a company they know for a fact doesn't care about them, and a company they know for a fact will cut them on a moment's notice, right? So I think it's both of those things. I think it is a social thing, but I also think it's an economic thing. I think if people were paid a lot better, had benefits, and had some type of job security, whether it be through a union or something else, I think a lot more Gen Zs would be open to being in the office.
Awesome. Well, thank you,
Wait,
Evan. Oh,
actually,
sorry.
I was wondering if there was a question about
Well, where?
child support. I wanted to hit that.
Wait,
Hold on.
where
I
is it?
saw it. There's a child support question.
I didn't see it, but
Hold on. I 100%. I don't know if you put the
here.
child support question,
We're a little at time, but like if we want to, okay. Can you put
there
it
it
in
is.
there
There it is.
again? Or I can scroll.
Yeah, I'm trying to scroll to find it, but I was like, oh, wait, I want to hit that one. Hold on. Hold on.
Oh, okay. Wait, I think it might be at the very top. Right here. When you say definitions of success by the part of men, where would that equate to prison terms due to unpaid child support?
Hmm.
Thank you. And this has to be our last question because we are at time.
Okay, hold on. So wait, repeat the question. Repeat the question. I want to make
Yeah.
sure I answer it.
Um, when you stated definitions of success by the part of men, where would that equate to prison terms due to unpaid child support? And I think it was like kind of when you were talking about like the gap between like like how men and women are voting, which makes a lot of sense when I'm like reading it out loud.
I like that question because it's a very complex question, and I think it's a big question. Here's what I'll say. I think for a lot of young men, there's a for a lot of young men, there's a very big want to achieve this level of to achieve a status in patriarchy that one, I'll say 100% does not exist, especially not anymore. But in their sphere of information and influence, they're getting so many reasons why that shouldn't happen, like why they did not achieve that. And the number one reason that they're getting from, unfortunately, the Charlie Kirks, going back to the Taylor Swift submit to your husband, Travis Kelsey, a little weird. Rest in peace. Um, but then also what you're starting to see is there's a lot of a demonization of child support because it's also a demonization of women, right? Because if you look at the stories that happen with divorces or with separations or paying child support, oftentimes you see the content you get is of men saying that they've been put on child support and they shouldn't have to be, and that the woman only had a baby with them to get child support. And I think it evolved from an economic situation where a lot of men could not pay child support because they didn't have jobs. Still to this day, that's kind of how it works. But I do also think that there's a large cultural shift to where men see child support as a systematic barrier to their success. And I think that's something that a lot of men have not seen, right? The idea, and I think a lot of men have also place a distrust of women to bolster that. I hope that answered your question. But I thought that was a very interesting question. That like I was like, wait, child support. It's like
This was a
let me
very,
take a note of
very
that.
This is a very, very insightful conversation. I learned a lot, shifted my thinking on certain things. And again, thank you all like for being with us tonight. I love doing these. Oh, she has one more thing to say, but we do have to wrap up.
And I'll
She
put my
said,
LinkedIn in the bio. I'll put my LinkedIn in the chat if
put
you
your
want to
LinkedIn
connect.
and yeah. He'll
And
put his
if you're in
LinkedIn.
DC,
Yeah, if you're in DC and you want to talk to Evan, he'll be around. This is really insightful. Thank you for attending these every Wednesday. This has been truly a really fun summer talking to you guys and getting to know you, and then having these conversations with all of our amazing hosts. Next week, we're going to be talking about organizing when you're in a hard spot. So times have been really tough. And so, how do we continue to do this work and not burn ourselves out and not get overwhelmed by like the state of everything? So, I hope to see you then. Have a great night and a wonderful weekend. Bye, all. And yes, so we're going to be sending those recordings at the end of all these sessions. So, just be patient with us a little bit. We got to get it all together, but we will send those out. Thank you. Bye.